Hey everyone, back again. All right, I have a little bit of an intro for this stuff here, but before jumping into it, we're covering Immanuel Kant's Prolegomena to any future metaphysics. But before jumping into it, hi, I'm David. I explain philosophical concepts and ideas and ways to make them accessible to you. So if you're new here, you can like, share, subscribe, do all those things. That'd be cool. If you found this on YouTube, you're going to be able to find it as a podcast on pretty much any podcast platform. If you found this as a podcast, you're going to be able to find it on YouTube where there's sometimes videos. If you want to follow me, you can do that on other platforms. If you want to contribute to me, don't. Instead, consider donating directly to Palestinian families or Palestinian organizations. I would really appreciate that. And if that's something that offends you, then this is not the place nor community for you. Okay, so Immanuel Kant's Prolegomena to any future metaphysics. The reason I'm covering this text, there's a few reasons. I want to do a deep dive into German idealism. So I'm thinking Kant, Hegel, Fichte, Schelling. We're gonna try to do them all, and a bunch of people you've probably never heard of. The reason I want to do that is because I want to understand German idealism better by reading this stuff sequentially, reading this stuff systematically. And this is a good place to start. The reason that this is a good place to start is because the Prolegomena is pretty much just a recap of Immanuel Kant's first critique, the Critique of Pure Reason. So these books came out, they're extremely important books, and I'm going to kind of talk about them as we go through here, but I've covered them on the channel. I think I covered the Critique of Practical Reason and the Critique of Judgment, so that's critiques number 2 and 3. I think I did an okay job with those. I do not think I did a good job with the first critique. Now, instead of going back and re-recording all that, because that took forever, I'm just going to cover this text. I'm going to cover this text, and I think I'm going to be able to get across a better idea of what Kant is doing in the first critique, because this is just a summary of that, essentially. And then in a few weeks, we're going to get into his a book that he wrote around the same time, called Metaphysical Foundations of Natural Science. So I hope that all of that interests you. I hope that you will enjoy what I do here and for the next few weeks into some German idealism. I'm going to sprinkle other stuff in there because it's going to drive me up the wall if I'm just reading these 18th and 19th century Germans. That'll really that'll bore me to death, but we're going to do some of it. So here we go. Immanuel Kant's Prolegomena to any future metaphysics, starting with the preface, as many books do. So this book, what it is trying to do, it is trying to develop a science of metaphysics, more or less. It is meant for those interested in pushing philosophy forward, not just reciting philosophies of the past, but instead pushing philosophy forward as a science. Now, what basis is there, though, to suggest that metaphysics is or can be a science? After all, it's been duped for so long. Now, if none of this makes any sense to you, that's okay. That's okay. This stuff, there has to be a lot of scaffolding. I'm going to try and supply it for you. But it's okay if you're not sure what this means. Like, metaphysics, what are you talking about? I'm going to explain it all. I'm going to try to explain it very clearly and concisely. And it might mean that, for if there are any diehard Kantians, you might be like, oh, David, that's not the right use of the understanding. Like, please, this is meant to be accessible for the widest audiences we can while trying to maintain optimally the proper kind of adherence to the philosophical canon, to Kant's lexicon, and so on. So when he asks whether metaphysics can be a science, what he's asking is if there can be universal laws discovered within metaphysics, or within what I will just call now the metaphysical world, that can be used to understand other things, events, phenomena, ways of knowing that usher from and that can be pointed towards the metaphysical world. So what do we mean by the metaphysical world? I'm just using the word here, world, for the sake of like clarity and brevity. There's inevitably some Kantians out there that are like, oh, it's not a world. It's not a world. And it isn't. Don't think that way. We're going to get into this in more detail. But just now, when we talk about metaphysics, we are talking about things that exceed the physical world. So questions that pertain to metaphysics include things like, is the universe infinite? is everything made of parts, or is there anything that's total in itself that's not made of parts? We're going to get into all of this. Or question of the soul, questions about God. These are all metaphysical questions because they aren't found in experience. Kind of. Now, what Immanuel Kant did with his first, second, and third critiques, the critique of pure reason, critique of practical reason, and the critique of judgment, what he tried to do there was to show how we can locate within the world of experience, the world that we can touch and feel and that we exist in, the world of cause and effect, of physical laws, etc. He was like, perhaps there are clues to be found within that world about the metaphysical world that do not just go off of like faith, that don't just say things that like, because a triangle is perfect in itself, this implies a perfect creation or a perfect creator, which could have only been a perfect being, which is God. So Kant would never argue that. He would never argue that. He would say that is just like fanciful, pure reason, which is why his first book, it wasn't his first book all in all, but like the first book of his shift in this direction, the critique of pure reason, was to critique that line of thinking, to say that any effort to think beyond the physical world, to think beyond the world that we can agree on, that we can see and touch, even though there are still a lot of things we don't know about it. Anything that goes beyond that, he says, is doomed to fail. So this book lays the foundation for a science of philosophy that does not content itself with pure reason. Obviously, in this case, he is indebted to someone like David Hume, but also he has a problem with Hume. And we're going to go through his issues with Hume, his issues with Descartes, I don't know if we'll talk about Berkeley, but there are other people that he had big issues with. But one of the things that Hume says, for example, is that we experience cause and effect in the physical world, and we just kind of go on faith that the world does operate through the law of cause and effect. But for Hume, all that we can kind of do, it's been a while since I've read it, but all that we can kind of do is maybe infer that cause and effect is a universal principle, but we can't really make that claim because we don't at all times see single cause producing some effect, or some effect having been produced by a cause, I should say. So because of that, David Hume was like, yeah, it's kind of cool that this cause and effect thing seems to be universal, but we can't really prove it because no one can see all of it at once. And Kant would be like, no, dude, please, are we really going to pretend as though there's any situation in the physical world that does not follow the law of cause and effect? Like, that seems absurd. So this is just one of many cases where Kant is going to look at something within the physical world, in this case cause and effect, and ask, like, it seems strange that it's a universal thing. It seems like because of its universality, it must comply with some order, with some kind of a law that isn't apparent to us as humans. So in a sense, Hume was right, but Hume was also wrong in that he wasn't willing to take it a step further and to question like what the law of cause and effect means, even if we don't know where it comes from, we don't know why it exists or anything like that. So that pushes us here into section 1, preamble on the distinguishing features of all metaphysical cognition. So for a science of a topic to emerge, we must first highlight its specificities lest it get wrapped up, I should say, in other sciences. So any science that we develop has to essentially have its own internal rules and laws and kind of principles that give it coherence and that allows it to be transposable to other dynamics and other settings. So for example, in the case of physics as a science and the laws of like gravity, we find that the basic laws that we have about that are applicable everywhere, more or less. More or less. I mean, there's obviously some quantum cases and dealing with large enough objects where it kind of falls apart, but it is astounding how applicable Newton's ideas of gravity and physics were, and they are applicable everywhere. in so many different cases. Yet it must still have a kind of internal coherence to it in order for it to succeed and to continue as a science that can be taken up and adapted while maintaining its kind of core principles. Now, in the case of metaphysics, it is important to distinguish it or to highlight its distinctive quality as its adherence to pure understanding and pure reason, because metaphysics doesn't deal with the physical world per se, that is, physics deals with the physical world, nor the inner world, like in your mind, like psychologically. It's not interested in that either. Instead, metaphysics as a science must try to discover what it is within experience, despite everybody having different experiences of the world, everybody having different ideas of like what is just, what is unjust, so on. Kant is like, what unites all of these people? That's not simply like their physical composition or their place in the physical world, nor their psychologies. He's like, there's something else going on, something that's, in his words, transcendental, which is a fancy way of saying, or let me put a pin in that, but he's asking this question in order to try and understand what is universal within subjective experiences or among subjective experiences. Now, he offers the idea of transcendental thought or philosophy in order to think through this problem. Now, for him, transcendental does not refer to like escaping some plane to arrive at a higher one, to transcend something. That's not what he means here. When he does transcendental philosophy, what he is doing is looking at the mechanisms that make a given thing possible. So, for example, in the Critique of Pure Reason, and we're going to get into more of it here, he asks, what operations are at play in the human mind and in its harmonious relationship with the world? What is going on to allow us to have experience at all? One of those things is that we as human beings are kind of born with a sense of space and time. We aren't ever sat down and taught what space and time are, because if that were the case, then space and time would exist exterior to us. But space and time for Immanuel Kant are not, it's not that as though those things are out there in the world or in the universe and we're just born into it. It is that they are constituted and shaped by our minds. So as the creatures that we are, we experience the world in 4 dimensions, I guess, if you include time. And so because of that, we are gifted with this amazing thing called experience, but at the same time, we are quite limited, and we have no idea how much we are limited. We have no idea what other ways there are to perceive the world and universe and what other dimensions there are. We have no idea. We'll probably never know, but they may exist. However, we experience the world in a certain way. That is, in a human way. Maybe we share the same thing with other living creatures, who knows? But this tells us that we are responsible for shaping the world, that is the universe, or how we process space and time, as much as those things are responsible for giving us life and allowing us to have experiences at all. Okay, so because this book is essentially just a summary, we're going to be doing a lot of like kind of definitional stuff here. So as a reminder, analytic judgments are one kind of judgment, but analytic judgments are those whose predicate adheres to the subject. So a predicate in a sentence is like the descriptor of the subject. So if I were to say the sentence, all crows are black, that's an apodictic, like no one could disagree, but it is an analytic judgment in that the predicate are black complies already with the term crow, because all crows are themselves black. So because of that, we are dealing with a kind of judgment that perfectly adheres and is concerned with itself. Whereas a synthetic judgment refers to experiences kind of in the world that are not universalizable. Universalizable, whatever. So for example, that crow is on the table. So in this case, there's nothing about the predicate on the table or is on the table that complies with a crow that we know of. Like not all crows are on tables. So this is a synthetic judgment, as it's just an observation of something happening in the world that isn't universally applicable all the time. Like saying all crows are black is universally applicable. Now, synthetic judgments can also be applied to math. So if you have a math equation, 7 plus 5 equals 12, this is a synthetic judgment because there's nothing about 7 being added to 5 that perfectly complies with the number 12. Like there's nothing to be found within 7 nor 5 as subjects here that gives you 12. This is a human construct. This is just an absolute creation of human reason, of the human mind, which we're going to get into in more detail because it needs to be unpacked a little bit more. That is the existence of universal laws that are human created, like in math and physics, kind of for that matter, versus those things that are just universal in themselves, outside of human reason, if such things do exist. Now, in his words, metaphysics properly has to do with synthetic propositions a priori. So what is that? What's a synthetic proposition a priori? Now, let's go back to the case of cause and effect. Cause and effect for Hume, like I said before, is just like a synthetic judgment. It's like, oh, well, that I dropped this pen, it fell on the ground. That's a synthetic judgment. I'm not making a universal analytic judgment here. And indeed, you can't. I can't always say that if I drop a pen, it'll fall to the ground. What if we're in space? It won't fall to the ground. That's not going to happen. So with the case of cause and effect, what Kant suggests is that we can find a way to offer synthetic judgment that's just grounded in experience, yet make an a priori claim about that judgment, like the case of cause and effect, where we know it is a synthetic, observable thing in the world, and doesn't always neatly comply with other cases of cause and effect. Nevertheless, we are able to extract from these disparate, different physical experiences and to locate a universal truth within them. That is the truth of the law of cause and effect. And so through that, we are given what he calls a kind of synthetic a priori judgment. So a synthetic a priori judgment refers to judgments that are grounded in and come from the world of experience, yet house within them universal truths, hence the term a priori. A priori refers to truths or ideas that are true in themselves and that are universally applicable. So before Kant, people like Descartes, Leibniz, Hume, etc., for Kant, all of these people just took metaphysics on faith. They didn't try to establish any kind of foundational assumptions or groundwork to build it as a science and then to apply it to different cases and settings to try to understand human experience, the human's relationship to the world, the human's place in the universe, etc., etc. Instead, just taking it on faith, they essentially just let it run amok. And for Kant, they did exceptional harm to this field. Now, even though many of them may have claimed to have been doing science of metaphysics, and they've been celebrated for furnishing us with some apodictic statements like those from Euclid or other people who did interesting stuff like that. Now, what these philosophers forget, is that these apodictic analytic statements are only the building blocks of a science that must then be able to proceed on its own and to apply its formal procedures and ideas to new contents without contradiction, which is what their approaches were not prepared to do because they were just taken on faith that God exists, or that the duality of humans between body and mind, etc., etc. Like things taken on faith without having actually been sufficiently grounded within the world of experience, which can then from there be extracted to a broader principle and observation about humans universally. So I feel like I've been kind of general here. Let's take Descartes. Descartes, very famous for his cogito ergo sum, whatever, the I think therefore I am idea. Very common, very popular very popular idea from Descartes. And what that idea essentially suggests is that I can doubt the physical world. I can doubt that this table's in front of me. I can doubt you're listening to me. I can doubt my own body. But the thing I can't doubt is my mind, because you need your mind to doubt. So you cannot doubt your way out of doubting. Your mind always persists. So Descartes' like, look, the mind is always existent. It is detached from the body that we can't be sure of. And then Kant's just like, this is how Kant responds. He's like, dude, seriously? Are you really going to pretend as though you don't think in a language that you acquired through like actually existing in the world? That you have the spatial and temporal cognition of the things you are doubting because you have not experienced the world? Like, we can't pretend as though the mind can just be separated from the body. And Kant's like, maybe it's true, but we have no basis to say that it's really true if we remain tethered to, in a very responsible way, tethered to our place in the world of experience. And that puts us here into the next section, titled General Question of the Prolegomena. Is metaphysics possible at all? Because after all, as we've been saying, how can we come up with a science of that which we can't see or experience? Now, this is the problem that he sets out to try to find the answer to. But this is one of the tricky things about this, where he's all about experience. He's all about the world that we experience and what we can learn there. But the book proceeds analytically. That is to say, he's going to just be using reason to the best of his ability that takes some observations about the real world, the world of experience, and then applies them and infers from them some possible laws or attributes of the metaphysical world. Again, world for the sake of brevity. So his objective before him, it's twofold. That is, he's trying to find a science of metaphysics, trying to discover metaphysics as a science, but also is asking, like, one of the implicit questions that runs throughout the course of this book is, what makes a science possible? Or what can bring a science into existence? And what does it mean if there is science? That is, there are the existence of fundamental laws that can be observed and then reapplied and used to understand how phenomena work in the world, in the universe. That is, we have physical laws to tell us what will happen as the result of various causes, etc., etc. What does this tell us about the universe itself? What does it tell us about humanity's role in shaping and constituting that very observable possibility that we see before us? Is it that cause and effect exists out in the world? Or is it that as human beings, we are only able to process sequential events in such a way as our brains are able to process them? We are only able to do so because we impose the expectation of cause and effect onto the universe, which is not what Kant would say. I'm just raising this really to kind of highlight the trickiness around this question and what it means to discover laws in the world. What does it tell us about us, and what does it tell us about the universe? Now into section 3, because sections are sometimes short, just like introducing a problem. So Prolegomena, general question. How is cognition from pure reason possible? So what mechanisms are at work to permit the application of synthetic a priori judgments to the world? That is, that we can infer by observing things in the world, we can observe and infer some universal attributes about those things. How is that possible? Like, as human beings, we have this capacity to do that. We are able to infer and to extend from beyond that which we see into the world of speculation that is still bound within the world of experience. So what I mean by that is that, let's just call this realist speculation or speculative realism in this context. And that is to be like, I think he gives one example in the Critique of Pure Reason when he says, like, no one has ever seen a clown on the moon. Or he says a monkey or something, or like anything. But that is within the realm of possibility. Like, even though nobody has experienced it, we can imagine it, and it can still be bound within the laws of the physical world that we understand in the universe. Assuming it probably has to wear a spacesuit and all that. But we can't do the same with the metaphysical world. We can speculate that God exists, or that God is infinite, or there's justice, whatever. We can speculate that. But we have no science that is a kind of ordering of the laws and systems used to grapple with those laws within that world to actually give it a kind of certain possibility, as we can apply to the example of a monkey or a clown on Mars or on the moon. Now the book will proceed. It'll actually get into the meatiness of it. It's the real meat and potatoes. That is, in order to answer this question, how is cognition from pure reason possible? And also to answer the general question of, is metaphysics possible and what does it look like? He is going to set out to answer 4 fundamental questions. And these are the main transcendental questions related to metaphysics. And some of them are like building blocks, and then they will build finally to the 4th question that really poses the question of metaphysics as science. So the 4 questions are these. Number 1, how is pure mathematics possible? Number 2, how is pure natural science possible? Which is something, by the way, we're going to take up in the next book that I'm covering in a couple of weeks, his other book on natural science and metaphysics, etc., etc. Number 3, how is metaphysics in general possible? And finally, number 4, how is metaphysics as science possible? Now, each of the following chapters takes on each of these questions. How is math possible, natural science, metaphysics, and then metaphysics as science? How are these things possible? And we're going to go through each of them one by one in each of the following sections, taking us right into the next one, the main transcendental question, part 1. How is pure mathematics possible? So the fact that human beings can make a priori statements or observations or generalizations based off of a very limited amount of sense data that we take in, we're able to infer certain universal things like all crows are black, or everything is bound by the law of cause and effect within the physical world. I mean, these are universal statements that are universally true, even though as humans I've not seen every single crow to confirm that every crow is black, and I've not witnessed how every single effect was produced to know that it came from a cause. Now, a little asterisk here. If someone's like, oh, I kind of already know this stuff, and doesn't Kant problematize the cause and effect idea when we think about like the origin of the universe? True, he does. We're going to get into that. Don't worry about it. But just for now, put that to the side. So that human reason is able to, and it can, make a priori observations tells us that there is, in his words, an a priori basis for cognition which lies deeply hidden. Now, of course, we cannot intuit, we cannot imagine an object a priori. We can only intuit our capacity to perceive objects in the ways those objects may appear to us. That is, their size, their shape, color, cause and effect, etc., etc. Now, also space and time are a priori and are the basis of maths like geometry and mechanics. Now, in the Critique of Pure Reason, he has this whole middle section where I think it's the Transcendental Analytic, and there's a bunch of subsections, and that's the one that I butchered the most, guaranteed, because I didn't really understand what he was doing with it. But in these sections, essentially all he's doing is laying out the ways in which human beings can process things in the world through either observation, like I can see something, I can see its color, I can see its shape, its size, etc. Then there's also the various judgments we can impart on it, like what qualities it possesses. Can it have contradictory qualities? If what those are, like I can have different taste about it as well and different ideas, but he breaks these down into what he calls the categories, and he calls them other things at different places. But these are the categories that work in such a way, and they are in operation in all of us all the time, that allow us to have experiences in the world. And as we said earlier in the episode, with regards to space and time, we intuit these things a priori, and they are, for him, they are the outward expression of, I guess, our mind's yearning for experience. That is, they are, at the very least, they are conceptions within our own mind that we impart onto the world, that is space and time, that we require to then have experiences of things in the world. Even if we don't really experience space and time in such a neat way. Because what really is space? Like, is space just emptiness? In that case, is what is in front of me right now, between me and the wall or anything? It's not really empty space because it's comprised of molecules. Or if you take the room you're in or the space you're in, whatever, and you were to zoom out like many galaxies away, and then you were to look back, in which case that space would no longer exist. It would no longer exist as the space doesn't exist when you look at a wall or an object. It's comprised of millions of atoms that is mostly empty space, but we don't perceive it as such. So the very capacity to even see space is subjective, and it's relative, that space is even processable. So as we cannot see space when we look at a table, because we see a hard table thing, even though it's mostly empty space, the same applies to us in like a room we're in, because if you zoom out far enough and look back at that same space, you find that the space has disappeared because of our capacity to see it. So in his words, to go back to the main question here, pure mathematics as synthetic cognition a priori is possible only because it refers to no other object than mere objects of the senses, the empirical intuition of which is based on a pure and indeed a priori intuition, that is, of space and time. Or, in the case of mathematics, when we're dealing with just like numbers, these are human creations. You never walk around in the world and see the number 1 kind of bouncing around. Or, even if someone were to be like clever and they're like, oh, well, we can infer a certain quantity based off of things that we see in their sameness. Like, let's say I were to take an apple and I were to have 1 apple and I were to bring another one in, we could reduce this to the formula 1 + 1 is therefore equal to 2 apples. While that is all well and good, there's actually nothing about an apple that signals a oneness about it. It is comprised of many different parts, but additionally, what operations are at play for us to equate one apple with another to say that they go from 1 and 1, in which the number 1 implies a certain sameness with the other number 1 that we are then imparting upon and imposing upon those 2 different apples. Because are those apples really the same? Are they the exact same color red? If they are red, are they the same size, same shape, same weight? And if they don't possess all those same qualities, what right do we have to say that 1 apple + 1 apple equals 2 apples? Because we're making a leap in calling them apples and agreeing that they are the same thing. Now, the point here is not to say, like, math, it doesn't mean anything. In fact, the exact opposite. It's a quite miraculous thing, and it's a very interesting thing that we're able to have this way of abstracting away from objects to provide what he calls a pure kind of mathematical representation of them in the form of a number that can then be used to make a priori ideas and statements found within the world of math, like 1 + 1 = 2, always, I guess. Maybe some cases where it doesn't, and other kind of apodictic elements of mathematics, like a triangle has 180 degrees, and the length of the hypotenuse is the square root, whatever, of the other sides type, you know what I'm saying, all that stuff. These are laws found there, and they're a priori, but they're bounded not in the world, but in the world of reason. That is, they are just applied and imparted onto the world as a human creation that nevertheless has real meaningful effects and can do things in the world. So in this case, pure mathematics, like pure geometry, operate at the intersection of the human faculty for synthetic a priori observations as it adheres to outer intuition and its ability to affect objects in experience, especially in the case of geometry, talking about shapes, again, like triangles. Like you'll never find a perfect triangle in nature. You don't walk around in nature and see anything organized in the way that is like a perfect triangle. That would be an amazing thing. If you happen to find something like that, that'd be amazing. But you don't really see that. So it's an abstraction, but it is an abstraction that nevertheless allows us to better understand the world through human ingenuity and our ability to apply a priori judgments to objects, to experience, to our capacity for experience, etc. Now he concludes this section by commenting on other commentators who branded Kant as just some other idealist. He says that he prefers the term critical idealism to transcendental idealism, which is interesting. I mean, I think that his whole point here, because a bunch of people after he wrote the first critique were like essentially just charging him with having done the same thing he was critiquing others with. So at the end of the first critique, he's like, look, we can't know about the noumenal world. So the noumenal world is like, we have the phenomenal world, and this refers to objects we see in front of us, we can touch, feel, we can all agree is like around, we might have different perceptions of it, but there might be something underneath the object. I'm just using the term underneath for the sake of brevity and clarity, but there might be a kind of realness or a truth to an object that evades our senses. So like, what does the table look like to another creature with totally different senses that isn't like a bat, for example? So if a bat sees the table, and if we were to ask the bat to draw a table, it would have a very different mental image and understanding of the table than we humans do. So which one is more correct? I mean, they're both up to what our brains and our senses tell us, but we don't actually know what the true table looks like. So at the end of the first critique, Kant is like, look, we can speculate that that stuff is there, that there's like a real true thing. But he's like, what's the point? Who cares? We'll never know. So instead, we have to try to look for truths in the world that we can see and feel and examine and engage with. But when he made this claim, idealists were like, look, you're just like every other idealist. These are people who doubt the reality of the external world. And they're like, oh, it's all just the mind. The mind is just creating things. There's no truth out there. It's all just a fabrication of the mind. To which Kant is like, no. He's like, there are universals that unite us all. It's not purely subjective, just like vibes in experience that you get to, your certain way of engaging with the world. He's like, there's more to us than that. There is something universal in us all that permits us to have experience and that we can't do away with. Moreover, we cannot ignore the way in which it is not simply as though we doubt what exists outside of us. It is that we must really respect that capacity to create this exteriority to us, that our minds are doing and that our senses are doing, and that we are able to process and make sense of in a way that allows us to inhabit the world and to move through it easily, for the most part, not be scared of everything, not to have to like remind ourselves what a tree is every time you see a tree because it looks slightly different than the previous one. Like, we're able to organize and map things in a way that allows us to move through the world and have experience that can build upon us and that we can build upon. Not just that we are always like in a chaotic, just responding to stimulation and not actually able to like take a step back and reflect on the world and ask, like, is this the best thing to do in this moment? Hence his moral philosophy, but also what experience is before us and what does it tell us about our place in the world? And that puts us here into part 5, the main transcendental question, part 2. How is pure natural science possible? So no longer pure mathematics, but pure natural science. So nature is obviously tricky, because it does not exist separately from us in our experience of it. Like, what really is nature? Like I said before, when we see an object, we're just seeing what our senses allow us to perceive of it. Who knows how a moose sees nature? Like, what is nature to the moose? Who knows? It's just its home. It just kind of walks around. It's like, it just navigates that space in a way that we'll never know. So when we engage with quote-unquote nature, we are not engaging with it in itself as though it is purely exterior to us, because in our experiencing it, we are actually constituting it in the way that it appears to us. The moose might appear totally differently to the moose. The moose doesn't have a more real vision of it than we do, and the moose constitutes it in its own experiencing of that world. It's just the moose, I assume, is not able to infer like broader, natural laws that it is then able to apply in the world and its adaptation to that world. Maybe it does. I don't really know much about moose, but maybe it does. Maybe I should be more respectful to the moose and animals. So it doesn't live, or nature doesn't exist exterior to us, right? Because we are constituting it and are experiencing it. Nor do we approach it purely synthetically, because that would mean that it possesses qualities that allow it to abide by universal laws without our cognition of them. Now, we can't have that because then it would mean as though we are kind of like alien in our own world. Because that, to say so as though it possesses its own laws, it is completely exterior to us, that is to say that it is somehow detached from us. When exactly the Kantian point is to show that the world is shaped by us in our senses, in the way that our senses allow us to apprehend it, in the form of like sight and touch and smell, etc. But we are aware of some pure attributes of the natural world, like its adherence to cause and effect. Everything within the natural world corresponds to the law of cause and effect. So how is it possible for us to extract universal laws from experience that's just subjective, it's just chaotic, it's just one thing after the other, who knows, we can't attribute any kind of law to it or sequence or whatever? Well, at first, we have only judgments of perception available to us, and they tell us essentially subjective things about the world. That is our just subjective individual experience with it. Then, from there, we develop judgments of experience that are universally true. For example, in his words, if the sun shines on the stone, it becomes warm. This is a judgment of perception. I'm seeing the sun shine on the stone and make it warm. In contrast, if I were to say, the sun warms the stone, this is instead a universal statement in its adherence to the law of cause and effect. Because in the first one, I'm just observing the sun warm the stone. I'm like, oh, look at that. But if I see a stone that's warm, I say it is the sun that warms the stone. I may say if it is the sun. In that case, I am attributing a kind of universal attribute to what the sun does in its relationship to things that its solar rays touch. Now, this is the move from just experience to what he calls the understanding. And the understanding is what allows us to peer through individual experiences and to discover truths about those experiences that might not be totally obvious in those experiences themselves, which is one of the amazing things. So, like, for example, the sun, again, if we were to rely on experience, the sun is like an inch long. You know, that's how big the sun is. It's an inch long, however long it is. It looks in the sky, whatever. It doesn't look very long. But we know we are able to look past that individual experience and are able to say, okay, how big is the sun really? And we now have an idea about how big it is, however big it is. I don't have it memorized. It's pretty big. And that is how we operate and navigate the world now, with this knowledge, this proper understanding of how an object, when it is a certain distance away, will take on a different dimensions just in our perceptions, not how it actually is. So when we perceive things as objects of experience, we are also interrogating whether or not that conforms to our understanding, to how things should be. Like, if you see a ghost, maybe you didn't. You know, it's like you think about what other things it could be. I hope you think about what other things it could be, and you're able to then make sense of it in that way. Or another one I like to think of is like, it's a really hot day and you go to the beach and you're like, I'm making the inference that because it's hot and the sun is blasting its rays on the water, then the water must be really hot. And then you come to find, no, in fact, on those hot days, it's when the water feels like coldest, because you go from the super hot sun and now it's relatively extremely cold. And this is like something that now I know if it's a super hot day, super sunny, the water's going to probably feel pretty cold. And that's because I'm able to override my senses and what I'm kind of perceiving in front of me with my understanding, and are able to make another observation that is outside of experience, but is also informed by experience. So how is nature possible? Both materially, as there are like things in nature, and also formally, as in these things, these corresponding and conforming to laws. In his words, by means of the constitution of our sensibility, in accordance with which our sensibility is affected in its characteristic way by objects that are in themselves unknown to it and that are wholly distinct from said appearances. He continues, by means of the constitution of our understanding, in accordance with which all these representations of sensibility are necessarily referred to one consciousness, and through which, first, the characteristic manner of our thinking, namely by means of rules, is possible, and then, by means of these rules, experience is possible. So we apprehend the world and nature through two primary kind of moments of contact. There's that immediate sense perception, which is a term Hegel would use later. Sense perception is just immediately what is coming at you in terms of the objects that you see. And that it is from there, just in this experience, that we're able to start to organize things in our mind. We're able to recognize the similarity from one tree to the next, and that we're able to kind of recognize as being somewhat similar. And then different people have different knowledges about exactly what different trees mean, and they take on totally different proportions, et cetera, et cetera. I'm sure that's, all of this is very important as well. But it tells us that we are able to, at the very least, make a kind of organizational leap with the processes of our mind so that we do not look at every single object in the world as though it's totally new. That would be strange. Like, we are able to look at one thing and then see like similar things through the application of our understanding, and we're able to then provide a kind of cohesive painting in front of us. And this is what allows nature to be possible for Kant. So then the laws that are found there, they're not found in nature. They don't come from nature themselves. Instead, they are found in the conditions of the possibility of experience that lie in our sensibility and understanding. For example, the universal laws of a circle are no less valid for having emerged from a non-real and synthetic thing like a circle, because there's no circles in the world. Maybe the sun, is it a perfect circle? I don't know, I kind of doubt it. But you don't really see many circles out in the world. And we are able to create this fictional thing that nevertheless has a priori universal principles that can then be applied to the natural world. But it is through that, kind of going through, in many cases, the prism of the non-real fictional application of reason and constructing these abstract things like mathematics, like geometry, etc., that we're able to better understand the laws found within the natural world. So that puts us to the next part, the main transcendental question number 3. How is metaphysics in general possible? So obviously we didn't need to prove the reality and value of math and natural science. They can prove themselves, right? Like, you take a math formula and then you can apply it to a bunch of equations, and you can demonstrate to someone that way the applicability of math, how it is, and by virtue of that, how it is a science, because it can extend beyond any given single example and apply to others according to these laws. Same thing with geometry. So in those cases, they speak for themselves. The challenging thing for metaphysics is that it, is not really given an experience all that easily. You can't just draw, like in math or geometry, you can draw up a circle. You can't draw God in metaphysics and be like, these are its properties, and then apply it to a different setting and different dynamic, and then you're able, that's not how metaphysics works. So that's the challenge. And that's why so far in this book, he's been laying the groundwork of what elements are universal within experience to then extract from them some possible attributes of the laws beyond the world of experience. That is, these laws of experience must come from somewhere, and they may have come from this other realm. Again, realm is not the word he would use, but I'm just using that word for the sake of clarity. So we needed to do this work, this groundwork, to understand the mechanisms necessary for experience and the apprehension of laws in experience. This will allow us to grasp metaphysics as a science and its concern with, in his words, pure concepts of reason that are never given in any possible experience. Now, to qualify, the distinction between understanding and reason is found in their relative applications. So the former, that is the understanding, it is immanent and provides overriding knowledge of the world that otherwise may be incorrect if we rely on experience alone. For example, the size of the sun, like I said before. Now, reason, on the other hand, it concerns itself with the collective unity of the whole of possible experience. And so he is concerned here with what he calls the totality of all possible experience, the whole of all possible experience, which means looking not at only myself and my own understanding as immanent. That is, like, I know that the sun is the size it is because, I feel this within myself. Reason, or the questions pertaining to reason, are universal ones asking what is common within us all, within each of our abilities to experience. This is why he calls it the totality of experience. He's like, what is common from one person to the other in their experience? And this is to look at the totality of experience and to find universal generalizable laws that are true within everybody's world of experience, like cause and effect, for example. So with the understanding, it relies upon the categories we mentioned before, like the size, shape, dimensions, color, whatever, of a thing. And then we're able to override it from there if we have to make adjustments, like the sun is not really an inch long. However, reason doesn't depend on those categories, on like size, shape, etc. It relies upon ideas. These are universalizable ideas found across all experience that are necessary to allow experience to unfold at all, and therefore point to universal attributes within us all that point to some possible influence from somewhere outside of the physical world, perhaps from another world. So what are these ideas? Well, they're judgments. That is, they are either hypothetical, categorical, or disjunctive judgments. So categorical judgments refer to those statements where the subject and predicate imply the other, like the crow is black. This is the kind of judgment that we're making here. And it's the one of three possible kinds of judgments that we can make in the recognition of something in the world and its appropriateness to our description of it. That is, all crows are black, universal statement. Great, perfect. Second, hypothetical judgments. They contain the relation of two propositions. For example, if I don't eat, I will be hungry. So here we have left this categorical statement that just confirms itself, all crows are black, to one that is now grounded in a kind of sequential recognition of a cause and effect. This is what we mean by hypothetical statements. If I do not eat, I will be hungry. So one of the easy ways to identify a hypothetical statement is like, if it includes an if, then a then. Doesn't need to, but that's often the case. Now, disjunctive judgments refer to the propositions that emerge within what he calls a community of cognitions and may be contradictory, but are nevertheless necessary and reveal frustrations and possibilities of the mind and metaphysics. So, for example, a disjunctive statement is one, not really an example, but to elaborate, a disjunctive statement is one in which two contradictory truths are to be found within the thing that we're confronting. So, for example, there is a beginning to the universe and there is no beginning to the universe, both of which are totally true and both of which are contradictory. That is, they are both false. So, I don't know, what might be another good example? Like, I love classical music, but, whatever you consider that to be. But I'm not listening to classical music right now. Does that mean that I don't love classical music? No. Even though love would imply a pretty strong attraction to a thing, it means I'm not listening to it all the time. But this is a disjunctive judgment insofar as it sort of contradicts itself. It's like two opposing truths happening at the same time. Or I always listen to classical music, I'm not listening to it right now. Something like that. But he elaborates on this point a lot more in the third critique, the critique of judgment, in which he thinks about the way in which that we impart various aesthetic judgments onto things. Like, we're able to recognize something, the beauty of a plant And it is from that we are able to perhaps infer that there's a certain end to the plant. It has a purpose that is designed within it as like satisfying our observation of it and our experience of it, which is not just our immediate, like this is its size, shape, etc., but how it moves us. So here, he's not trying to apply pure reason. Remember, he doesn't like pure reason when it's just naively applied to things. So here he's kind of using it, but he's remaining tethered to the world of experience. So he specifies that reason merely demands completeness in the use of the understanding in the connection of experience. That is, it demands this kind of consistency and conformity. Now, the unbridled use of reason drives it to various insoluble antinomies. If reason tries to exceed the world of experience, it's going to run into some problems. So what are these? I mean, you'd have to read the end of the Critique of Pure Reason to really get them in big detail. I mean, he talks about them here. But essentially, he points to the limitations of reason in its trying to understand metaphysical dilemmas. Like, for example, some of the things he talks about is like the universe being infinite. We don't know. Is there a beginning to the universe? We don't know. And he provides like a perfect argument for both cases. He says that the universe must be finite because if it was infinite, that would mean that there's an infinite amount of space between every 2 points, which would mean that therefore like stars would go out, planets would be too far away from one another, we wouldn't have experience, etc., etc. But then he says that actually the universe must be infinite because if it was finite, then it would have had to come from somewhere, meaning that it contradicts itself in having some kind of an origin that exceeds itself, it having a cause that exists outside of it. So that doesn't make any sense. So it must be infinite. But this is exactly the dilemma here that he's trying to show, that if we just naively apply pure reason, we're just sitting in our chair, just trying to like think our way through the problems of the universe and God and morality, etc., we will be doomed. We'll be totally led astray. Or we will arrive at this dialectic where we can't go any further. It's one or the other. It can't be both. Or another one he thinks about is whether or not we have free will, where he says that if we are truly bound by the law of cause and effect, we don't really have free will because we are always determined by what comes before us. Now he says that this presents an interesting problem in relation to the question of the beginning of the universe. Because like he says that if the universe is finite, that means that there is an origin point. He says that even though it means that it is complying with some kind of law of cause and effect, that is, the universe is an effect of something, he specifies that this must have come from something other than itself, something of a different realm, a different kind of possibility that we could possibly know. And he says that this would actually mean that there is freedom because there's something that happened once within the chain of cause and effect that exists outside of the domain of cause and effect, how we understand it. So therefore, something that exceeds experience as it is given to us, implying that while we are the architects of the world and universe that we see and touch and experience, this would imply that there's more beyond that, something that exceeds it, and therefore leaves room for the possibility of there being some kind of element to the organizational texture of the universe that's not just up to like the mystery of human experience and organization. Perhaps it points then to a god of sorts. But one of the ways that he resolves these antinomies, where they're both true or both false, he says that in all their cases, because there's 4 different ones, in each of their cases, it can be solved by going back to the idea of there being a phenomenal world, the world we see, feel, touch, etc., and the noumenal world, that which is like exists underneath objects that we can't actually access. We can speculate it's there, but we'll never be able to access it because we can only have a relationship with objects through our senses. So he's like, okay, well, in that case, perhaps then the universe is infinite according to our law of cause and effect. Like, it's just always existed, and within it is this kind of drudging cause and effect going over and over and over and over and over again. Maybe that's the case. Maybe that's the truth of the phenomenal world. And it's within the noumenal world that we have this finite thing, where we have this kind of origin occurring. Or, we could think about this even in, if you wanted to, I don't think you can think about it in reverse. But the same thing with like freedom, where according to our senses, we aren't free because we're just determined by cause and effect. But we are able to infer that if there is something beyond that exceeds the boundaries of that, let's say in the noumenal world, then there is the possibility of freedom, because that means there's a domain that exceeds and transcends, not transcendental, but transcends the phenomenal world into the noumenal world, and therefore possesses some amount of free movement and free reign that is not found in the physical world. So he's able to kind of solve these antinomies by pointing to his own system and his own way of grappling with the distinction between the world we see and the world that exceeds those appearances. But that puts us as human beings in a very interesting spot, because on the one hand, we exist within experience. But just like any other object that I was suggesting before has a kind of truth to it, truth in quotes, I'm just being, I'm exaggerating a little bit, has a certain truth to it, so too do we humans have a kind of noumenal truth that we can't access, because our relationship with our bodies, with our being, comes to us through our senses. Like, you see yourself, you touch yourself, you smell yourself. That's how you know you have a body. But that body possesses qualities that might exceed what your senses are able to tell you about it. So as human beings, we then occupy a very interesting place. We exist in both the phenomenal and noumenal worlds. And this is what will inform his whole moral philosophy, where he's like, look, if we were just purely objects within the physical world, that we would just be like responding to stimulation all the time. That's all we'd be doing. We'd just be like a paper bag in the wind. Like, any force works on us, we would just respond to it in a kind of cause and effect way. But as human beings and other living creatures, we are able to negotiate that. We're able to say, okay, there's this thing happening, and does it conform to my idea about what should happen as a result? And this applies to morality as well. And because we are able to do that, Kant says that perhaps because we exist in both of these worlds, perhaps there's some kind of freedom type motivation ushering from the noumenal world, and that gives us the potential to exercise a will that allows us to negotiate the world in a way that not only is just responding to it, it's not only just organizing it according to our transcendental sensibilities in our mind and our organizational functions there and the faculties of our mind, but also to see through all of that and to negotiate what is best for ourselves in that moment according to our will, which is a little bit of a demonstration of freedom. Even if it is bound still by cause and effect, it is able to still exercise some amount of like selfness, some individuality, some kind of, a self in that case that exceeds and that moves beyond the realm of what should just be given to us if we were just objects of evolution or just objects of the physical world. And that is the beauty of reason for Kant, in that it is caught between these worlds, trying to deduce pure laws from the sensible world. And this is why any efforts to try to understand God within experience are fruitless. Like, for Kant, he's like, yeah, I mean, if there is any truth to be found about God, we're going to need to consult experience, at least to some extent. But that is only the starting point. Kant is not going to content himself with just being like, we look at experience and that's it. I mean, he's trying to find universal laws that applies a kind of analytic judgments, that applies a priori ideas and et cetera on things, and isn't just like, well, this is how it is in the moment, we have to decide right now, which is the kind of the core of his moral philosophy. He's not critiquing people who are just like, try to come up with these highfalutin ideas about the universe and the world. He's instead there critiquing people who are like, judgments are just subjective, just in the moment, you just decide, like practical reason, like whatever's going to happen right now, we'll figure it out. Kant's like, are we really going to base our morality on just individual moment-to-moment vibes? Like, as human beings, can't we do more? And haven't historically we done more? Where humans can negotiate with one another what they mutually agree to be morally responsible and proper in any given setting, and that can be applied to others. And in a sense, as I said before, as us being the architects of experience, we are in a sense the very thing we are looking for. You know, we are the gods that we are looking for, which is, I mean, kind of blasphemous. I hope it's not too insulting to anybody, but I mean it in the sense that any proof of the existence of God is to be found within us, our relationship to experience, and how we can unite that experience with universal laws. So if we are to proceed with a proof for a supreme being's existence, we must first identify it as, in his words, a supreme reason as a cause of all connections in the world. Just as a watch has a watchmaker, the consistency in our application of reason across all beings must have some kind of an architect behind it, even if we can never know it, which is the closest he gets, I think, to breaking his own rule of pure reason. Like, this isn't a great argument. Like, yeah, the watch has a watchmaker, therefore humans, you know, have a divine creator. I mean, this is obviously a leap. And a hardcore Kant scholar would probably understand why he used this example more. It just feels to me like he was trying to put a bow on his book and to be like, there's this possibility, y'all. There's a possibility, and perhaps if we pursue this question of metaphysics further, we can clarify what this kind of this architect looks like. Not with the hopes of depicting this this being, but instead of like understanding it. And this is the good speculative use of reason. One that is like still respects and remains tethered to experience, but also tries to apply that interesting part of reason that allows us to move beyond experience, to think about difference, to think about other things, more than what we have. And that brings us to the final part, solution to the general question of the Prolegomena. How is metaphysics as science possible? For a system of metaphysics to emerge, it must first assign the roles of sensibility, understanding, and reason in conjunction with the synthetic cognition a priori and the categories. Which ends quite abruptly, but all he is saying here is that our capacities for sensibility, like experiencing things in the world through our senses, of our understanding, of then organizing them and finding commonalities between them, allowing our minds to break through the illusions found within experience, and finally reason as that overarching understanding of the totality of experience. When we unite these three things with synthetic cognition a priori, so synthetic cognition is like finding these within experience, these universal laws like cause and effect, and the categories, like the ways by which we're able to make recognition, we're able to recognize things in the world in their size, shape, color, etc., all that stuff. And then that in conjunction with the ideas we mentioned before, like different kinds of judgment, like as hypothetical, categorical, disjunctive. It is this is the groundwork of establishing the unity of these things, how they work together to furnish us with universal laws and attributes to experience and the universe, that we're able to then from there discover the possibility of a kind of architecture of the mind, of experience, and of the universe itself as the outward expression of our sensible intuition, like the outward expression of our own minds and the ways in which we apprehend, we're able to take in and understand the world. And yeah, that'll wrap that up. And then next time, we are going to dig into Immanuel Kant's metaphysical foundations of natural science. And then after that, I think I'm going to dig into some post-Kantian responses, like within the world of German idealism, and eventually get up to Hegel. I've already covered the phenomenology of spirit, and I think I did that okay. I think that's not so bad. There are a few things that, and for those of you that listen this far, I'll leave my opinions and stuff to the end in these moments for those people that are dedicated enough to listen. But one of the things that, it's tricky on the one hand to cover these kinds of texts in this way, because nobody is just going to have one impression of them. Like, I've read the Phenomenology like twice now, and I think I'd only read it once before I presented it, but I do a bunch of other research on it to try to know what the hell I'm talking about. But it takes like years to really digest these books, and I imagine like now I have a different impression of the Phenomenology than I did a few years ago when I recorded those episodes, and in 10 years I'll have a totally different one. And yeah, it's just, I don't know, and I don't have the time to go re-record them, so I think that one's okay. But yeah, I don't know, it's tricky to kind of navigate all this. But yeah, so I'm going to get into some other German idealist stuff. If you have any recommendations, let me know. But if there's anything I got wrong here, anything that I should have included that I didn't, I'd love to hear about it. But yeah, on that note, hope you're all doing well, and take care.